Next up, we're happy to welcome the CEO of Guard Therapeutics, Tobias Agervald. Welcome, Tobias.
Thank you. So I'll be presenting on behalf of Guard Therapeutics. And Guard Therapeutics is a clinical stage R&D biotechnology company, and we have a particular interest in the area of acute kidney injuries, or often referred to as AKI. Acute kidney injuries is a very big clinical problem. We have about 13 million individuals per year being affected of AKI. There's a very high degree of morbidity and mortality associated with AKI, in particular cardiovascular disease, but also other complications that relates to AKI. In the most severe instances, the patients usually need dialysis treatment, which is initially a life-supporting treatment. But there's also progressive elements, even if the patient develop a less severe form of AKI, not requiring dialysis treatment, they could still progress to something called chronic kidney disease, with a chronically impaired kidney function and a lot of need to also support and control that with medications, etc. We also know that patients with AKI and also chronic kidney disease, they have a very poor quality of life, usually worse than many forms of cancers. So this is really large unmet medical need, and there's no precision drug treatments available. There are no therapies available, essentially. And I think this is the very important need that Guard Therapeutics is trying to fill. So there are multiple different patient segments that can develop AKI, usually develops in conjunction with serious illnesses, for example, infections, or in major surgeries like cardiac surgery. And actually, during open chest cardiac surgery, this is the most common complication you can actually see in these types of surgeries. And if we start with cardiac surgery, we know that there's about 800,000 individuals having coronary artery bypass graft surgeries being performed each year. These can, of course, be performed in conjunction with or without valve replacements. And only in Europe, and there's about 400,000 surgeries being performed. So this is a really big and common kind of surgeries that are being performed globally. And due to the surgical procedure itself, with the use of a heart-lung machine, a lot of patients can actually develop an acute kidney injury that really becomes very severe and progressive. There are no precision drugs, again, treatment available today for AKI, and this again is something we specifically want to look at and develop a novel treatment for in cardiac surgery patients. So the lead investigational drug that Guard develops is called RMC-035, often referred to as Roscord. And we think this drug carries multiple benefits. It's a very versatile drug with potential for clinical efficacy, with a broad set of actions that really we think is an important distinguishing factor for generating efficacy in cardiac surgery patients. And it blocks multiple different pathways and really impedes the downstream cascade of injuries that is really associated with an initial acute kidney injury. And in the orange box, you can see some of them here. So for example, it reduces heme toxicity by direct binding to heme that results from hemolysis when we use a heart-lung machine. It's also a very important antioxidative molecule, both by binding directly to free radicals as a scavenger, but also there's a reductase component, so there's an enzymatic conversion of free radicals into inactive species. We also know the molecule directly binds and stabilizes mitochondria, which is again a very important mechanism both in acute kidney injury but also in chronic kidney disease. So there is a high degree of mitochondrial dysfunction, which we think this molecule actually protects. So overall, the molecule supports and optimizes tissue regeneration, and all these components, both individually and synergistically, we think is very critical for protection and prevention against AKI and also in cardiac surgery patients. So today we will not discuss a lot of preclinical data, but the company has done in the past multiple and different disease models. So there's a very robust preclinical pharmacology package. And there's also documented effects in a lot of models beyond AKI. So for example, the molecule also protects bone marrow injury, protects against radiation-induced organ injury, and preeclampsia. So I think based on this very broad set of effects and pharmacological effects, we think there's a good chance that the molecule will also translate into clinically relevant effect in AKI prevention. So this is a model how RMC-035 protection in cardiac surgery, how we envision that this actually works. So the compound RMC-035, it's administered as an intravenous infusion. So the patient actually gets this as a couple of infusions within the first 2 to 3 days, immediately in conjunction with and after the cardiac surgery procedure. And we think there are 3 principal components that actually happens and that precipitates and increases the risk for AKI. So the first one is hemolysis, which I explained. That means that the red blood cells, when you use a heart-lung machine, so the red blood cells will actually be distracted, and there's a release of free heme from hemoglobin. And the heme component actually is filtered and taken up by the kidneys and is directly toxic. And again, RMC-035 actually directly scavenges and neutralizes heme. The second component is ischemia. So essentially there's, due to the heart-lung machine, when you have the cardiopulmonary bypass, there's sort of a continuously small repeated ischemic injuries to the kidney that is the main sort of culprit for developing AKI. And again, the molecule we have has been shown to robustly, and it's not kidney specific, but also in the kidney, it's really being protective against these sort of ischemia reperfusion injuries. And thirdly, there is an inflammatory cascade which sort of is precipitated by these 2 components and also triggers an AKI in the kidney. And by giving the drug intravenously, we have sort of 2 shots. First, we can actually prevent all these mechanisms directly in the bloodstream when the molecule is being infused. But secondly, we also know the molecule is rapidly distributed to the kidneys and actually taken up by the proximal tubular cells in the kidney, which is the initial site of injury. So we really have 2 kind of separate steps where we can achieve this level of protection. So in summary, we have a lead molecule now with a very broad set of molecular actions that targets multiple critical pathways that are relevant for AKI development. And since we base this molecule on an endogenous defense system, this is something we actually want to augment and think this increases the translatability of demonstrating a clinically relevant effect also in patients. So the way we design the clinical studies now is a preventive design. That is, we give the first infusion of the drug just immediately before the patient goes into cardiopulmonary bypass. The patients are asleep, they are on the operating table, and just before we connect the cardiopulmonary bypass, then the patients will receive the first drug. But we've also seen in the non-clinical studies that if you give repeated dose administration, even in the ones that already have AKI, they seem to also attenuate the emerging and ongoing AKI. So this is kind of an early intervention strategy, and we want to combine these 2 to achieve the best effect as possible in patients. We also think that the molecule has effect to really reduce the risk of serious health complications due to AKI. We already mentioned cardiovascular morbidity, mortality, and progression to chronic kidney disease. And obviously, there's a possibility to avoid improve quality of life metrics and really avoid disability, which is related to AKI, and such as lifelong dialysis treatment. So this was kind of the background on the indication itself and the molecule. So just a few words about the market potential and the space in AKI. So as always, I mean, this is a really, really big market. So the total AKI market is estimated to more than about 200 billion SEK. Of course, that entirely depends on which patient segments, which diseases you try to sort of squeeze into this classification. But I think the bottom line, no matter how you flip these numbers, there's a huge unmet need and there's a huge market for this indication. Looking at the number of surgeries, there's about 800,000 CABG surgeries performed annually, and only around 400,000 of those are being performed in the US and in EU5. There's also an increase sort of number of surgeries, so the growth rate is about 5% over the past years, and that's also something which is predicted to persist. So again, there's a huge patient population. So we focus initially on the high-risk patients that undergoes cardiac surgery, so roughly about 1/3 of those patients. So we think that a patient segment of around 150,000 patients in EU and EU5 would really be the most critical one that we also include in the clinical trials. So the estimated peak sales in cardiac surgery alone, based on this limited patient populations in cardiac surgery, is estimated to about 5 to 10 billion SEK. So overall, again, cardiac surgery AKI, that really provides a very attractive commercial opportunity in drug development. When it comes to the clinical competitor landscape, there is a very limited competition. It's not like in the oncology space when there's so many compounds coming in and the development becomes very complex. So actually there's no approved drugs yet in this space. So all the trials we're doing are placebo-controlled trials. Just listed a couple of the most relevant competitors here. So RMC-035 or Roscord is in the orange bar. And below that we see a couple of molecules, one from Amgen and one from Astellas called ASP1128. Those molecules are currently evaluated in phase 2 trials, so they're a couple of years ahead of Guard Therapeutics. The last one, QPI 1002, that's the most advanced molecule in clinical development. They've just completed recruitment in a global phase 3 program, but we haven't heard anything yet in terms of results. On this slide, I also try to pinpoint some of the really key mechanisms that we think is important. So you can see in the columns. So for example, we have a multi-target mode of action. We have mitochondrial binding stabilization. We have reducing heme toxicity, etc., etc. And as you can see, RMC-035 really hits all these different marks and dimensions that we think are critical for efficacy. So I think the key point here is that RMC-035, it's a first-in-class treatment, and it really has favorable differentiation properties in case there would be a competitor that gets first to market in this space. Then going to the clinical program of RMC-035, so in the spring of 2019 we initiated the first clinical trials, and to date we've completed 3 separate trials. The ROSO-1, which is a single ascending dose study in healthy subjects. The ROSO-2, which is a multiple ascending dose study in healthy subjects, specifically designed to support any AKI indication in the future. We've also done ROSO-3, which is a renal impairment study with the primary objective to look at the pharmacokinetics of the molecule in relation to impaired kidney function, because that becomes critical when we're going to dose the first patients in cardiac surgery AKI, to set the right dose, both in terms of safety, of course, but then also in terms of the expected efficacy level. So overall, these phase 1 studies have been completed, and they all indicate that RMC-035 itself, it's safe, it's well tolerated, and no serious adverse drug reactions being reported to date. And as alluded to, the phase 1 program, I mean, we initially target cardiac surgery AKI, but this really is built to support additional AKI indication beyond cardiac surgery. And just a couple of words on the pharmacokinetics. This is a technical slide, but again, it's important to understand. So the molecule, we see dose proportional pharmacokinetics. So that means if you give twice the dose, you have about twice the exposure on the plasma levels. We also know that the molecule is very rapidly eliminated from the plasma because it undergoes filtration in the kidney and it's being taken up by the kidneys. So there's a very rapid initial decline in the plasma levels. The total exposure, which essentially it's the area under the curve of the concentration over time, that's proportional to the level of renal function. And that's something we learned from the ROS03 study. And that is something we also consider now when we set the first dose and the dosing strategy and the dose levels in the phase 1b and also the upcoming phase 2 study. And the final point is that with this dosing regimen, there is no systemic accumulation of the molecule. So essentially, it's all being cleared very rapidly. So on the figure you can see on the bottom here on this slide, there's essentially, this is based on the regimen where we give 5 doses over the first 48 hours. This is the dosing regimen we intend to carry forward now in the phase 2 study. And as you can see, the peaks don't vary that much, so the Cmax levels are about the same. And again, there's no accumulation of the drug in between these doses. And the ongoing study that we do now, the first study we're doing really in the target patient population, that's a phase 1b study. So this is a randomized double-blind study that we conduct at a single site in Germany. It's a small study. We have included, or we plan to include 12 subjects, 8 being allocated to RMC-035 treatment and 4 to placebo treatment. And as you can see, the target patient population, that is subjects undergoing non-emergent open chest cardiac surgery at moderate, even high risk to develop perioperative or post-operative AKI. And the projected enrollment period is in Q1 to Q2. And as recently communicated, we already recruited the majority of these subjects, and we actually plan to finalize the recruitment now in June. So this is something to watch out for. In a couple of months later, we will also be able to share the top-line results. And this is, again, a very important study for Guard and for moving forward into the phase 2 program. And this really leads up, so the phase 1b study in cardiac surgery patient, that really adds up to sort of the final clinical package that we use to optimize the phase 2 program. So that is something we work on intensively right now. We have multiple support, both internally, but of course with external advisors. We have multiple KOLs and a separate scientific advisory committee that supports the design of the phase 2 study. We're also confident from a regulatory standpoint that we have a good case, because the 3 of the first phase 1 studies were conducted in Sweden, and the project was extensively reviewed by the Medical Product Agency, MPA, and the equivalent in Germany, which is called BfArM. And the company also had a pre-IND meeting with the FDA in December 2020, essentially working out and having a discussion about the phase 2 program, and we don't get the message that there's no need to do any further clinical or non-clinical studies to proceed into phase 2. And of course, the program of or the final sort of design of the phase 2 program, that will be communicated following the results of the phase 1b study, because that's really when we have sort of the final pieces together. So that is expected to come towards the end of summer. And the phase 2 study, if everything goes as planned, hopefully we can actually have the first patient in towards the end of 2021. So again, aggressive timelines, a lot of things happening, but exciting times for Guard. So I think this is my final summary slide. So I think we're moving forward based on a very robust scientific foundation. We see RMC-035 as a potential sort of universal treatment in multiple different patient segments, not only cardiac surgery AKI, although that really becomes our initial focus. We've done the clinical phase 1 program, which supports multiple AKI indication. As just alluded to, we have the results coming very soon of the phase 1b study, which is the first time this compound is given to critically ill patients in the ICU in conjunction with cardiac surgery. I didn't mention anything on the IP end, but the company also has a very strong IP position. So the compound is protected until 2037, which is of course critical for protecting the future commercial potential and also negotiating potential licensing agreements in the future. Over the past year, the company also recruited multiple new team members into the management team. So we have now a senior and very well experienced team of drug developers in the company. And as alluded to, we had the AKI indication itself. There's a very high degree of commercial scale up and the commercial potential, and there's a favorable competitive landscape without any kind of approved drugs in this space. And Guard is also well ahead of a lot of competitors. There's just a couple of competitors ahead of us. So that is it, and thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Tobias. I just have a few questions for you. I wanted to start by asking you what kind of interest you've seen from potential partners.
Yeah. So as mentioned a little bit in the presentation, so this is not like an oncology space when you have thousands of compounds going into preclinical stage or into clinical development. So we have a very good understanding of which companies are already active or moving actively into the AKI space. And actually there's an increasing activity right now. But the number of companies are quite limited. We know them very well. They know us very well. And of course, I cannot comment on any specific discussions, but again, the level of complexity is smaller here, which we find very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I also wanted to go into the indications. You mentioned that Roscord could go into other AKI indications. So I was wondering what your long development plan is.
Yeah. As always, when you're a R&D stage clinical company without revenues, I mean, you really have to carefully consider, the risk return on any kind of investment you do. So I think the most critical part now is really to start the phase 2 program and generate efficacy data in the target patient population. And we set out that to be cardiac surgery patients. So that is really the key now for us. In terms of expanding beyond that, I mean, we do see multiple opportunities where they're sort of a similar dosing regimen. Something we actively are looking at is kidney transplantation, where you can actually prevent AKI, but in the transplant setting that's usually referred to as DGF or delayed graft function. But the objective could also be to improve the overall graft function over time, so essentially improving the graft survival. Mm-hmm. And the dosing regimen would also be very similar to what we do in cardiac surgery patients. That is short-term dosing just in conjunction with the surgery to really minimize all these ischemic injuries that occurs.
Mm-hmm. So long-term there is a lot of potential there. Yeah. And finally, what are some of the key milestones we should be looking forward to in 2021?
So obviously I think the phase 1b study, this is it's a small study but yet very important because again it's critically ill patients. We test this now in really ill patients for the first time, and this is also the final piece of the puzzle when we get very important information. And of course we will start exploring some early sort of pharmacodynamic markers of efficacy. We know it's a small study, but that's something we will also be able to do. But ultimately then the planning, submission for the phase 2 study, and even hopefully having the first patient in by the end of this year is something we're really looking forward to, and again, very exciting times. So those would be the 2 sort of key milestones for the company.
Great, sounds exciting. Well, thanks so much for your presentation today.
Thank you.